Well, let me welcome everyone to this evening's event. We are celebrating tonight the newest book in the series with the only, I think, apparently oxymoronic title, The New Antiquity. Matthew, I think you'd agree with me, it's only apparent. From the wonderful press Palgrave Macmillan, which is a series edited by our own Matthew Santirocco in all of his spare time, and I'll introduce Matthew in a second. But I'm Jane Tylas. I'm the faculty director of the Humanities Center here at NYU, and it's a real privilege to be here for our great books in the Humanities launch tonight. This volume, which I am happy to wave around, I know there are some copies that were out on the desk earlier, and there will be more copies later for sale. So if you did pick one up, I'm afraid they were not free, but you can certainly talk to our wonderful Palgrave Macmillan editors after the event to purchase your own copy, which I'm sure you'll want to do after tonight's talk. But this volume came out of the annual Ranieri Colloquium in Ancient Studies, which was held here at NYU in the fall of 2011. And it was co-sponsored by a number of other NYU departments and centers, including our own. So it's great to see the tangible results so quickly of what was really a marvelous series of papers. This is a book, and it was a conference that focused on the topics broached in the book itself, which is about understanding the relationship between the Roman poet Lucretius and modernity, however we might understand that term. And in any case, the book seems to very solidly contest the claim that's made by a young Marx as he was beginning to write his dissertation, and with which Jacques Lezra opens his essay. His claim, a young, very sure of himself kind of guy saying, it goes without saying that but little use can be made of Lucretius. So I think almost 2 centuries later, this is a book that shows that a great deal of use can be made of Lucretius when thinking about modernities, the uses to which he can be put, the uses to which he has been put, and maybe more importantly, the uses to which he hasn't been put yet, which is, again, a sense I think you'll get from reading the wonderful essays contained therein. Perhaps most bracing, and this is my last observation, is that even if Lucretius may not be a wholly modern man, he's certainly a Renaissance man, a scientist, a poet, a philosopher, a moralist, and historian. And I think one of the striking features about Lucretius and modernity is the fact that it is so in itself interdisciplinary as a way of respecting what we would now call a very interdisciplinary or a very Renaissance Lucretius. So let me, with this, introduce our moderator. Tonight we have with us not only the editor of our series, but our Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, Matthew Santirocco, who is also a professor of classics and the founder and director of NYU's Center for Ancient Studies. He has written and edited several books, including Unity and Design in Horace's Odes and Latinitas, The Tradition and Teaching of Latin, as well as a number of articles. We would be here all night if I went through Matthew's entire CV. Matthew's currently working on a book about the poetics of patronage in Augustan Rome. He is a past editor of American Classical Studies and of the Quarterly Classical World, and among many other distinguished honors, he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So with that, Matthew, I will turn everything over to you. Thanks so much for being here, to you and to all our panelists.
Jane, thank you so much. I'm so delighted to join Jane in welcoming everybody here. I have to tell you, though, I had a panic attack walking over here because I ran into a very distinguished NYU colleague in the humanities. I won't tell you her name, but she was very apologetic for not being able to make this evening's event. She had another appointment, but she said she couldn't wait to hear what I had to say about Lucretius. I'm not saying anything about Lucretius. My sole role, I wouldn't dare to in this company, my sole role is to introduce and moderate people who know so much more and have so many interesting things to say. But I am happy to be here because I have something to say too, and what I have to say is thank you. I want to thank the people who made this event possible. I want to start, as always, with Jane, not just this event, but what the Humanities Center, I guess most everyone here has been, I hope, to other events, but what the center has been doing is just extraordinary. And I want to thank you. I want to thank Gwyneth Mallon. I want to thank all the folk associated, the faculty committee with the leadership of the center, and really the magical things that have happened, of which these book launch events are but one of many, many programs, and we're so proud and delighted. I also want to thank other folks at the center, Denny Valentine, who's the administrative assistant, Chris Alexander, who's tucked away in the back. He's the center's media and communications director, who produced this beautiful poster for us. Alexandria Martinez, the graduate assistant of the center. And outside of the center, I want to thank Kit Frick, the departmental administrator in comparative literature. Maura Pollard, the coordinator of our Center for Ancient Studies that Jane mentioned, and also Kevin Davis, my colleague in the Provost shop. And last but not least, I want to thank the Dean of the Graduate School, Anna Harvey, and her team for covert assistance, for working behind the scenes to reschedule an event that had been counter-programmed with this one, and for relocating another event. I just want to give everybody a sense of how much effort has gone into producing this celebration tonight, and how many people we have to be thankful for it. In addition to being able to thank people, I'm really delighted to be here for another reason as well, because as Jane said, this book grew out of a conference that our Center for Ancient Studies sponsored, and then, as if that weren't enough, I had really a great honor and privilege to be able to publish this book in the Palgrave Macmillan series that I edit, that of the oxymoronic title, The New Antiquity. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the magnificent Bridget Shull, who is the editorial director for literature of the press, who is here with us tonight, not just for obviously co-sponsoring this event, but even more for her commitment to the humanities and to humanities scholarship at a time when many presses, not just commercial but university presses, are trimming their humanities lists, especially in the areas of pre-modern and ancient studies. Palgrave has moved into this space, and they've moved into it as a space that they had not been in previously, by launching not one but two monograph series, The New Antiquity, and one on late antiquity, edited by Danuta Schanzer at the University of Vienna. I hope you won't mind if I put in a pitch here for The New Antiquity. The series is designed, as the title suggests, to promote original and significant scholarship that crosses boundaries, not only of discipline, but also of time and place, and that displays new critical approaches. So the first volume we published was Horace and Houseman, by a British philosopher who is giving Richard Gaskin, who's providing the first full critical comparison between these two poets. The second volume in the series was Combat Trauma and the Ancient Greeks, a collection of essays edited by Peter Meineck and our colleague Dave Konstan, who's on tonight's panel. And as it happens, that volume too grew out of an ancient studies conference. So if you or anyone you know is doing cutting-edge work on any aspect of antiquity and its reception, I hope that you'll consider publishing with us. And I'm available this evening or at any other time to discuss projects. Did I do that okay, Bridget? I did okay? Gotta please my boss, right? I first encountered Lucretius's poem, De Rerum Natura, as a freshman in college. I can still remember it as an intellectually exhilarating, but also deeply personally liberating experience. And that's actually saying a lot, since my freshman year was quite liberating in other ways as well. Won't go into all of them for the sake of discretion. But I had moved from an intimate Jesuit preparatory school to a huge, diverse, secular university. And since my freshman year was 1968, my introduction to college also coincided with a massive student uprising, a spring Dionysiac ritual of sorts. And yet, amidst of all that excitement, it actually was Lucretius who made the greatest impression. You know, raised on Catullus, Horace, Virgil, having written the book on Horace, I had never encountered anything, and still haven't, quite like Lucretius. And I was struck not only by the sheer, almost percussive power of the poetry, but also by the courage required to embrace the philosophy. It's wonderful that decades later, Lucretius continues to be rediscovered, now as an icon of modernity. Stephen Greenblatt's recent Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, is a recent example of this, but the resurgence of interest in Lucretius has been several decades in the making, as physicists, philosophers, political theorists, intellectual historians, and literary critics have all become interested in this text and its long reception. The book that we're launching tonight, Lucretius and Modernity, Epicurean Encounters Across Time and Disciplines, represents a major advance in this conversation. And we're fortunate to have with us the two co-editors of the book and two of the contributors. So I think what I might do now is introduce our panelists and then just turn you all loose. And then at the end, we can see if you want to respond to one another for a bit, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and answers. Okay. And then everybody, of course, is invited in the back to the reception, and particularly the book party, and we hope you'll get a copy of the book, and if you're nice, our authors may even sign it for you. So anyway, Liza Blake is assistant professor in the graduate department of English at the University of Toronto. She also teaches in English and drama there. She works at the intersection of literature, science, and philosophy in medieval and early modern literature. She's currently completing a book manuscript with the great title, Early Modern Literary Physics. Professor Blake received her PhD right here at NYU, and it's wonderful to be able to welcome back our colleague to celebrate the publication of her book tonight. I'll also introduce next to her, her colleague is co-editor, Jacques Lezra. Jacques is professor of Spanish, English, and comparative literature here at NYU, a scholar of staggering range. He's published in several languages and on numerous topics from Shakespeare to Freud. His books include Wild Materialism, The Ethic of Terror and the Modern Republic, which has been translated into Spanish and Chinese so far. Right? Unspeakable Subjects, another book, The Genealogy of the Event in Early Modern Europe, and a forthcoming book, it's out in a few weeks, on Cervantes, which is collecting previously unpublished and published essays that he has written. He's currently at work on another volume on the nature of Marx's things, the same title that he used for his chapter in this book. Having written on contemporary and early modern translation theories and practices, Jacques is also himself the author of several translations, including a rendering of Paul de Man's Blindness and Insight into Spanish. He also co-edits with Paul North the book series Idiom, which is published by Northwestern University Press. And we're delighted to celebrate your publication tonight. As we heard from Jane, Brooke will be here, we hope, momentarily, but let me introduce folk right now. To my right is David Konstan. David left Brown University in 2010 to join NYU's faculty as professor of classics. I have heard David described on numerous occasions as a one-person department of classics. This is not true, not because of any lack on his part, but because very few departments, even large ones, have his intellectual breadth. His research focuses on both Greek and Latin literature, especially comedy and the novel, and on classical philosophy. In recent years, he's investigated the emotions and value concepts of classical Greece and Rome. His books include, I'm going to read you some titles, but this is by no means an exhaustive list: Sexual Symmetry, Love in the Ancient Novel and Related Genre; Roman Comedy; Pity Transformed, Greek Comedy and Ideology; Friendship in the Classical World; The Emotions of the Ancient Greeks, Studies in Aristotle and Classical Literature; Before Forgiveness, The Origins of a Moral Idea; A Life Worthy of the Gods, The Materialist Psychology of Epicurus; and, most recently, Beauty, The Fortunes of an Ancient Greek Idea. He's currently working on a verse translation of Seneca, a former president of the American Philological Association, which has now been renamed the Society for Classical Studies. He's been awarded Guggenheim, NEH, and ACLS fellowships, and in 2009 was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I guess I'll introduce Brooke now so that maybe we don't have an interruption in the flow. What do you think? Yeah. Okay. So Brooke Holmes is professor of classics at Princeton, where she also directs the interdisciplinary PhD in the Humanities. But the title of her academic appointment doesn't really do justice to her range of interests, since she's also a trained comparatist, a philosopher, and an intellectual historian. Her research explores the Greco-Roman roots of Western ideas about the body, the natural world, matter, and the non-human, and the problems these ideas create for concepts of the subject, ethics, and politics. Her books include The Symptom and the Subject, The Emergence of the Physical Body in Ancient Greece, and Gender, Antiquity and Its Legacy, in that series of that name. She has also co-edited several volumes on Aelius Aristides, on the reception of Epicureanism, and on the frontiers of ancient science. She's currently working on a book entitled Tissue of the World, Sympathy and the Nature of Nature in Greco-Roman Antiquity. The recipient of many awards, she currently holds a 3-year Mellon New Directions Fellowship and is the PI of a Global Collaborative Networks Fund grant that supports the Post-Classicisms Network. So I think at this point we can stop my introductions and turn the floor over to Jacques and his colleagues.
Thank you so much, Matthew. In the vein of extending gratitudes, I want to acknowledge some of the sources of funding for the original conference that this volume came out of, who were very much in our minds as we were putting together the collection, and who provided material support for that conference and a great deal of encouragement as we worked through the different laborious, extremely laborious, excessively laborious processes of getting the book together. In addition to the support of the annual Ranieri Colloquium in Ancient Studies from the Center for Ancient Studies, we were supported amazingly by the Department of Comparative Literature, the Department of Classics, of French, and Philosophy. And I want you to bear in mind how many different sorts of departments were at work in this, because it has something to do with the nature of Lucretius, that he finds a kind of niche or a pocketbook or a wallet in a very quite an assortment of different places. So comparative literature, classics, French, philosophy, the Humanities Initiative, of course, the Gallatin School for Individualized Studies Fund for Classics and the Contemporary World, the Program in Poetics and Theory, and the Medieval and Renaissance Center. I could fictionalize it and say that the Center for Molecular Biology, and then but not quite, but they could well have done, because one of the great extraordinary things about Lucretius is that capacity to pick many pockets, intellectual pockets over time. That also, to my mind, is one of the great peculiarities of the reception of Lucretius, which I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes on. The peculiarity is this, that although and because he picks many intellectual pockets, and by that I mean strictly that the themes that Lucretius treats in the poem cross any number of disciplines. It's very, very difficult to find before this book, which I commend to you for that reason alone, before this book, to find a conversation between and among the different pockets that are being picked by Lucretius, that is, between the different disciplines that Lucretius is working with. So it's very difficult to find books in which a historian of science, a classicist, a political philosopher, a philosopher, and a literary historian are sharing the covers of the book, even such splendid covers as this one here. This book then tries very hard, and to my mind succeeds scandalously, in bringing together many of the different disciplinary pockets that Lucretius fits in and picks over the course of the De Rerum Natura. I think that it bears asking the question, why is it that it's not easy to put people who read Lucretius from different angles together in the same room and have them have a conversation on what ostensibly is the same book, on one hand. On the other hand, it's important, I think, to ask why it would be that now, today, in 2015 and 2016, such a conversation between the covers of a single book becomes possible. Here I think that we should imagine Lucretius as a kind of symptom of a moment in the humanities that's quite particular to the one that we're living today. And we might describe it as a symptom that concerns two different directions that the humanities might be taking. On one side, under the pressure of defunding of humanistic disciplines in favor of STEM and technology disciplines, the increasing interior disciplinarization of the humanities, that is, an increasingly autonomous sense that each discipline has to legitimate itself on its own grounds and establish the forms of its authentication on grounds that are privative to it. It and it alone gets to say what matters and what is good and what is of concern to the discipline. So on one side then, under the pressure of defunding of the humanities, an increasing autonomization, or even atomization, if you want to use a nice Lucretian term, an increasing atomization of disciplines. On the other hand, however, the increasing fantasy of the possibility of interdisciplinarity as a response precisely to the pressures of the defunding of the humanities. Lucretius seems to me to be a symptom of both of these sorts of situations. On one hand, his text is a text which crosses amongst as many disciplines as you can imagine. There's very little in Lucretius that isn't in the world, and very little in the world that isn't in Lucretius. And this, it seems to me, is a place where his fantasy role today in the atomization of the disciplines, and also in the possibility of interdisciplinarity as a response to the crisis of the humanities, is at work. Like any symptom, the name Lucretius and the tradition of Lucretius bears a double sense. It's not only a response to this anxiety on one side and fantasy on the other, but it has a kind of double sense. A symptom can be the response to a trauma or a disease, or it can be the response to a moment of pleasure or of fantasy. A forerunner to our book, The Swerve, imagines Lucretius, shall we say, as the standard bearer for a new humanism and for the emergence of a humanistic modernity which lights the way toward freedom and towards the possibility of interdisciplinary inquiry in our modern enlightened period. It's not that we, Liza and I, argue against enlightenment, humanism, humanity, all these wonderful things. It's that we don't think that that's a satisfactory reading of the poem. We think that it represents a kind of fantasy of humanistic enlightenment that is a bad response if it's the only response to the crisis in the humanities. And for that reason, among many others, we chose as the cover of our book the absolutely fantastic but rather morbid, if you want, representation by Bush of the triumph of death, which, if you wanted to think of it, is a way of reading Lucretius backwards from Book 6, the Plague book, a famously controversial, difficult book, because it doesn't seem to square with the rest of the poem's emphasis on a kind of catastatic pleasure and capacity to move beyond the affections of the world and so on, and instead is quite tragic and very visceral and very grotesque. So we wanted to read Lucretius not as merely or only the heroic embodiment of a kind of humanistic fantasy of enlightened interdisciplinarity, but also for what he is as well, a diagnostician of contingency, a diagnostician of the most absolute form of finitude in the human experience, and someone who's writing for all of the people whose work is covered in the different chapters that concern the reception of Lucretius. For all of those people, Lucretius was a dangerous, devastating in some cases, not just instrument, but model for inquiry and for writing. And I think in particular of Marx, who, as Jane said, begins one of the notebooks on Epicurean philosophy with that rather off-the-cuff observation, it's like, oh, we can't do anything with Lucretius, but then spends a lot of the notebooks doing so much with Lucretius and using Lucretius to beat up on almost everybody else in the Epicurean tradition and in most other traditions, and is a kind of hammer to hammer Hegel with also, which is not to say nothing when you're talking about Marx's relation to Hegel. So in any event, our hope is that you will at least linger on the cover of the book as a way of rethinking the entrance into Lucretius as not only a symptom or an expression of the fantasy of enlightened humanism, but also as one of the great catalogers of the absolute finitude of human experience. Thanks.
As Matthew mentioned when he introduced me, I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, but I did my PhD here at NYU, and I was at NYU when we had the conference that sprouted the early versions of these papers, and I was on the job market while this book was in progress. So I thought I would actually talk with you today about what it was like to be on the job market with a work in progress on my CV that said Lucretius and Modernity as its title. It didn't have the sexy subtitle yet. Paul Grave helped us with that. So I had a book in progress, Lucretius and Modernity. There was a collection of essays. And I had this interview at a school which shall remain unnamed unless I have enough to drink later, and then we can talk, but for the moment will remain unnamed. There were 3 people interviewing me, one of whom who was clearly advocating for me, was asking very generous questions, one of whom was sort of stoic and neutral, and the other of whom hated me passionately, hated me so much. And I know this because she was allowed to ask the first question in the interview, and her question was, and I quote exactly, "I'm sorry, I don't think your book project holds together at all. Will you please go through your project chapter by chapter and justify to me why you chose the text that you did to analyze?" So being in a good interview, I said, I would love to tell you more about my project. Thank you for that very generous question. In chapter 1, early modern literary physics, I argue that a 16th century translator of Ovid turns him into a crypto-Neoplatonist to develop this weird Platonic cosmology. And she said, what does that have to do with Lucretius? And I said, it just doesn't really, but she's fine, go on. Well, in another chapter, I think about a late medieval dramatist who tries to insert vitalism back into the long history of Aristotelian physics. What does that have to do with Lucretius? Etc. This proceeds. So finally I figured out, because I stalked her before the interview as you do, finally I figured out that she had seen that title on my CV, Lucretius and Modernity, and assumed that I was espousing the kind of thesis that said something like Lucretius invented modernity. Finally, we moved on from the horrible religious Middle Ages where no one ever felt pleasure except by accident, and if they did, they had to whip themselves for days and they regretted it, forever after. So she assumed that I was in that camp, and she was trying to get me to say something like that so that she could then attack me. After I realized that, I tried to sort of persuade her that I was, in fact, in her camp. I wasn't playing into that sort of narrative of Lucretius inaugurated the dawn of the modern era, and finally people felt pleasure for the first time, and that the title, Lucretius and Modernity, might be understood as something like, instead of an exclamation mark, Lucretius and Modernity, might be understood as something like with a question mark, right? Lucretius and Modernity? It didn't work. I did not get an on-campus interview for that one. But I've been thinking about that a lot lately as we're doing hires in my own university. And I've been thinking about it especially as we sort of roll out the book and it appears in print, because I do think that the title still should, to some extent, be read with that question mark. And I think the reason that it isn't, the reason that the book isn't Lucretius and Modernity, is because of the origin of the book, which was, of course, this conference we had, where we had this very sort of blank, studiedly neutral title, right? Lucretius and Modernity. And the contributors, the people giving the papers, had to figure out what that meant. The other great advantage of having that very neutral title without the question mark from the very beginning was that it really, I think, was calculated to annoy classicists. And it did. It really bothered them. So most of the papers in the conference and that are now in the volume itself are sort of have roughly the same underlying thesis, which is, why do we keep talking about Lucretius and Modernity? Why do you keep putting those words together? Can't we get over this? So, for example, Brooke Holmes uses the sort of the vague, neutral prompt Lucretius and Modernity to use Michel Serres' reading of Lucretius to rethink temporality and periodization. David Konstan, as I'm sure he'll tell you later, argues that Lucretius actually should maybe be considered postmodern rather than modern. Joseph Farrell, in the most sort of getting chapter in the book, argues that, in fact, Lucretius is an evangelical fundamentalist who is behind all the scientists of his day, who was just preaching the good word of Epicurus. So for the most part, if you really want a sort of irascible reaction to that title, those are the chapters to go to, the ones that are by classicists, except of course for the introduction, which is just a work of superb genius, I must say, but otherwise the classicist ones are quite good. In the introduction itself, which Jacques and I co-wrote, we speculate on the different things that modernity might mean when you use a phrase like Lucretius and modernity. And then also, just to be extra tedious, we speculate a little bit on what "and" might mean in the title Lucretius and modernity. And so for the rest of my time, I'd like to just read to you about 1.5 pages from our introduction, where we think about the title itself and what it sort of means to us. And now you imagine me being both Jacques and myself combined. I would make my voice deeper, but I don't think my throat can handle it right now. So I'll do more hand gestures. When we refer to a work, no, I'm not going to do that. You do. When we refer to a work or an author's modernity, we have in mind at least 3 things. First, works or writers are modern in a flatly chronological sense when they write in an era generally called modern, the era of print culture, of the emergent nation state, of secular conceptions of association of identity, of interiority, and of scientific method. We call modernity what we often recognize as our period, and we usually designate as beginning in early modernity. The we here means not just me and Jacques, but scholars, critics, and a general public that accepts a normative Burkhardian or Weberian historiography and imagines the European human animal to have suffered a period of darkness after antiquity, from which it is reborn when Petrarch climbs a mountain, or when Gutenberg revolutionizes the mode of textual production and of distribution, or, as in Greenblatt's account, as Jacques has already mentioned, when Poggio Bracciolini comes upon the manuscript De Rerum Natura. Even within the volume, you'll find the word modernity variously defined. Phil Mitz's chapter, for example, begins by arguing that for the discipline of the history of philosophy, modernity actually begins with Cartesian philosophy. In the strict chronological sense, then, Lucretius is not and cannot possibly be modern unless there's like a Doctor Who episode I don't know about, living as he did centuries before modernity in any definition began. Modernity in this first usage, and this is the bad part, usually signals a step out of obscurantism, dogma, enchantment, or mythology, out of the rote performance of identities and into a world and a worldview in which method, interiority, subjectivity, and an emergent sense of autonomy emerge to replace these older ways of being. So that would be Lucretius and modernity. The step is a historical event. Modernity arrives at a moment, and we can judge it to have arrived from a moment. Needless to say, this prejudicial understanding of modernity, which is inseparable from the value judgments, both explicit and implicit, in no way squares with what scholars of earlier periods have shown to be true. Some of the clearest and most cogent critiques of the negative effects of this polemical modernity were collected in a cluster of miniature book review essays in the journal Exemplaria. If you think classicists get irritated by linking Lucretius to modernity, you should see how medievalists react. It's amazing. It's a really good book review cluster. Essays that reconsider Greenblatt's argument about the world becoming modern by means of Lucretius from scientific, historical, book historical, literary historical, affective, secular, and ideological perspectives. Second, works and writers may be modern as well when it seems as if they belong to our period as we understand it, belong to it stylistically, conceptually, or thematically. And here the governing concern is to understand how different times come to see Lucretius' poem as modern, where modern means something roughly like contemporary. The modernity of these older modern writers or works is not a matter of when they wrote, but of how or what they wrote. They are in these respects our contemporaries. Apuleius's ironies are not only precursors to the novel this mode of defining modernity might define, they speak as much to our day-to-day experience as Mons' narratives or Bolaño's. Chronology and modernity in this way of defining modernity will prove antagonistic and in some cases quite separate concepts. And finally, a work or writer may be modern or may have a relation to modernity when a later writer has based his or her modern work, now in either of the first two senses, on an earlier one. We might say that we are speaking of something like Lucretius in modernity. Among classicists, this reception history is often treated separately from the poem itself. So, for example, Gillespie and Harvey's Cambridge Companion to Lucretius breaks down its table of contents into antiquity and reception, the latter collecting essays that treat how Lucretius was taken up and reworked in different centuries and countries. A number of the chapters in this book operate by this understanding of modernity, seeing how and why Lucretius' poem moves into different times, disciplines, and authors. Now, matters get slippery very quickly, of course. A chronologically modern writer may write deliberately classicizing pre-modern works. Our understanding of what makes our modern era modern may differ. One critical school's modernity is another's archaism or another's postmodernity. An author may be inconsistent and appear out of time with him or herself. Lucretius, for example, may appear modern because of his secular impulses, but non-modern because of his antiquated scientific beliefs, something, as I mentioned, Joe Farrell's chapter argues. Someone may well be my contemporary, though not yours, though you and I live at the same time. And I've already mentioned David Konstan and Brooke Holmes' contribution to these issues. Lucretius himself, the poem itself rather, makes matters harder for us still, and it helps not at all, indeed quite the contrary, to observe that the tendency to make things hard for its readers and audience on this point is one of De Rerum Natura's most recognizably modern features. That's a Jacques sentence, I didn't write that.
Whenever it gets really incomprehensible, that's my sentence.
It's true. So, Lucretius as non-modern, Lucretius as modernity, Lucretius as modern, or Lucretius in modernity. Modernity as a period, as historical causation, as atemporal, untimely connections, as a set of traits that define a way of thinking, writing, or acting in the modern world. There's a mixture in the book of two issues that are normally separate, or at least addressed separately, that of periodization and that of reception studies. And I think the real power of the book is that we're sort of squishing those two questions together. Each raises difficult methodological questions. Under periodization, we must decide whether and then how to separate historical periods, what attributes belong to which period, and which authors or thinkers or artists belong where, or how to smash all of that. In reception studies, if we accept that classical texts are resolutely classical, ancient rather than modern, then we must decide how to conceptualize the interaction between the classical past and the modern present. Are these texts and thinkers our contemporaries, mutating and almost living beings, changing with each century in response to new environments? Or are they texts of an ancient moment whose potentiality to be used or misused by future centuries depends more on the ingenuity of those centuries than it does on any individual text itself? Our chapters cut across both of those grains. They recognize the distinction between how we conceive of periods and how we conceive of reception is itself both a characteristic of a period, ours perhaps, and a mode of reception. Some of the chapters ask polemically what is at stake in classifying or refusing to classify Lucretius as modern, especially Farrell and Konstan. Others use the question of classification to rethink temporality or reception itself, including Brooke Holmes, who's just made a dramatic arrival just in time, Warren Montag and Elaine Gigondet, or to rethink how Lucretius' travels through later centuries might warp the history of philosophy, Wilson, Mitsis, and Lezra, the history of poetry, Hardy, or the history of politics, Kavanaugh. So, if you, like many members of search committees when I was on the job market, saw the title of the volume being spoken about tonight and came to this event wondering, what is the relationship between Lucretius and modernity? Or even better, what is at stake in asking such a question? I am now prepared to tell you the answer. The answer is inside this book, which you should buy. Thank you.
Well, I'm a contributor of a chapter. I did my undergraduate degree in the university up the road, Columbia, in mathematics. And so I picked for my topic in Lucretius the atomic theory. And this would look easy. After all, what could be more modern than a theory in which the entire universe is constituted out of small particles, material particles, and empty space, and that's it. There are no Platonic ideas. There are no abstract ghosts governing things. And while there are gods, this is true, they don't pay any attention to us human beings at all, for the very good reason that if they did, they couldn't be happy. And who wants a God that's unhappy? So we in the absence of gods who neither create nor govern nor guide the universe nor punish us for our misdeeds nor reward us for our good behavior. In the absence of gods, the universe itself has no purpose. It has no direction. It wasn't created for anything. In fact, it wasn't created at all. It went on forever. There's no beginning and there's no end. Time and space extend infinitely. To fill this infinite space, there's an infinite number of atoms. There's no teleology. And this indeed sounds very modern. So my task should have been very easy. But then I complicated it. Because the atomic theory of Epicurus has some features that are odd. For one thing, the atoms, although they are the smallest physical items in the universe, and everything is made up of them in various combinations, which produce secondary qualities, such as color and so on. The atoms are colorless themselves. Nevertheless, they're not the smallest things conceivable, and they are constituted out of still smaller things, which Epicurus and Lucretius called minima, the tiniest things possible. And being the tiniest things possible, they have no parts. No parts at all. Well, if they have no parts, then they don't have an inside and an outside. They don't have edges, because an edge is the edge of something else. So you can't, when you have particles that have no edges, if you put them together, they will overlap completely, because there's no edges to join them. As a result, how on earth do these point-like things ever form an atom? The answer is they don't. They're always already in atoms. They're inseparable from atoms. You can't have a minimal part by itself. And as a result, this is why Lucretius refers to them not just as minima, but as minimal parts, because they're essentially parts. They're only parts. Well, this reminds us of some things in modern physics which are equally complicated and hard to fathom. Quarks. Quarks are these 2/3 or 1/3 like particles that can never be separated, don't exist on their own, but are posited as parts of elementary particles. So that was one thing. And in fact, the idea of minima leads to certain problems that ancient and modern critics fastened on at once when they wished to attack the theory of the atomic theory of Epicurus. One of the problems, maybe the major problem, is this. These things, these tiny minimal parts, they're not points. They have extension. But it's a minimal extension. It's so small that it leaves these particles with very strange properties. Still in all, they have some extension. And if you're going to, for example, make a cubical atom out of however many parts you like, it's going to have a diagonal and it's going to have a side. And that diagonal and side, if these are real minima, they're going to have to be commensurable, because there will be X number of minima on the side, Y number of minima on the angle, a diagonal, and you can put one over the other and it will be a normal fraction. But the ancients had already demonstrated that the diagonal and the side of a square or a cube are incommensurable. There is no ordinary number fraction that can possibly express that relationship. Epicurus knew this. It was demonstrated early on in ancient by Pythagoras himself, and certainly the scientists of his time and the mathematicians of his time knew this full well. So this was one of the arguments that was used against this idea of minima. If you want to make them points, okay, but then points don't have extension. If you're going to give them minima and give them extension, something's not going to work in pure geometry. Another problem was the swerve, the very thing that forms the title of Stephen Greenblatt's famous book, now famous book and very fine book. Here are atoms which are moving in the void. The only way they change direction, and they all move at a uniform speed. And the only way they change directions is if they collide with one another and then they bounce off in random directions and things change. However, every once in a while, an atom just shifts course arbitrarily, without any rhyme or reason, without any law that governs it. And for Lucretius, at very least, and in this he may or may not be reflecting Epicurus' own view, this may be a later development, for Lucretius, this is associated with the possibility of free will. We are free because the universe, even though it's only atoms and void, even though there are no gods guiding it in any way whatsoever, is not wholly determined. There are breaches that introduce the unexpected, the arbitrary, the aleatory, if you like. That is to say, from the Latin word alea, meaning a die, the throw of the dice. So these random movements also look like something in contemporary physics. They look like what we think of as quantum motions, which cannot be predicted, which are introduce the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty into the structure of the universe. So these were problems. How on earth could a swerve exist? Why did it exist? Why introduce such a totally random item into an otherwise well-determined, scientifically objective universe? That, together with these minimal parts, which seem to go against the very notion of classical geometry, as the ancients understood it, caused problems for the way in which Lucretius' atomic theory, or Epicurus' atomic theory, was an anticipation of modern atomic theory. This is why I was inclined to see Lucretius as postmodern in his atomic theory. Modernism gave us Newton. Modernism gave us a world nicely determined, nicely organized, without random swerves, and without these arbitrary, strange little minimal particles that couldn't possibly be integrated into a systematic mathematical model. So I thought of him as postmodern. And then I had a digression. Well, if Lucretius is pre-modern, and at the same time somehow postmodern, where does a modern fit in? And I came to the conclusion, while thinking about this very problem, that the modern might be thought of not as today, but as a particular, maybe not historical period, but way of thinking that was bracketed by the pre-modern on one end and the postmodern on the other end. And what if we think of the modern now not as the conclusion, the end product, but rather a strange, arbitrary interval, something that dominated social thought and dominated our subjective awareness of ourselves, but only for a certain length of time. And that what postmodernism has done is leap back into the pre-modern experience, and which gives it something more in common. And I looked at some examples. I mean, I will just cite two. One of them was the novel. You think, what does the novel have to do with this? Well, the novel, the very word, the English word novel, was contrasted in the 18th century with the idea of a romance. A novel was a real bourgeois fiction. It was realistic. It was down to earth. It described people as they really were. It was faithfully mimetic. Whereas the romance were the medieval chivalric novels or romances, stories, fantastical, the kind of thing that Cervantes himself had ridiculed, but at the same time written a version of. And even earlier, we had novels that the British novelists knew very well. We had Petronius, his Satyricon. We had Apuleius with a donkey, a man in the form of a donkey, an ass, who wanders through the world. Well, this doesn't look like a bourgeois novel. You might call it a primitive donkey Quixote. That's a bad joke. Okay. And even the Greek novels, which did exist, looked a little bit different. And if they did look a bit like the modern novel, and in fact, Sir Philip Sidney, who had written the Arcadia, a fine and very important novel in his own right, had thought of the ancient novels as a model for the modern, but even these novels were distanced. They were mere romances. It was Britain that had created the novel, not the French, not the Spanish, certainly not the Greeks, not the Romans, not anybody else but the British. Now, there was something nationalistic about this. There's no question about it. But on the other hand, we also know what they mean. These were a naturalistic phenomenon. And something like Cervantes looked very different. Cervantes, some of you may know, had written the first part of his romance, Don Quixote, and then let it go. And in the meantime, somebody else wrote a sequel. And this irritated the hell out of Cervantes, so he wrote his own sequel. But not only did he write a sequel, he wrote a sequel in which his Don Quixote hears about another Don Quixote that's been wandering around and assuming his name and having adventures of his own. Now, what could be more postmodern than to have a character in a novel hear about the character in another novel and interact with him? Another such text that had intrigued me was one called Jacques le Fataliste, Jacques the Fatalist, written by Diderot. Here's a novel, 18th century novel, in which a character in the novel argues with the author over the question of whether the character has free will. Well, that's a strange kind of thing. It could easily be a postmodern kind of invention. So what if the strictures of the modern novel, the truly modern novel, all the novels we think of as classical, were themselves only an episode in the history of fiction, in which very inventive moments of fiction that went way outside the rules that these British novelists had imposed on the nature of the novel, where we were now able to see how that was a moment, and we've come back to writing very different and reading and enjoying very different kinds of fictions. That was one, and the other, I'll be very brief, had to do with art. We all have learned that it was the Renaissance that created perspective in art. Now, if you look at ancient paintings, it's not that they lack perspective. It's that they lack an overall perspective that governs the entire image. If it's a complex image, I mean, after all, they could make sculptures that were absolutely lifelike and have determined what we think of as lifelike sculpture. But when they painted, they didn't do this. And in the medieval paintings, neither did they do it. Well, what is it about a perspective that's so great? Well, it looks realistic. It seems to have depth. It's very mathematically structured. But it has a real limitation. In order to enjoy a perspective painting, you have to stand in one place and look at it. If you move off to the side of the painting, it loses its perspective illusion. You can't see it from the side. One thing you can't do is have a frieze, for example, on a temple and walk along and have the entire frieze in perspective, because you won't enjoy the perspective anymore. So perspective is a very strict limitation. It situates you in a very particular place, and you must look from there. It's very dominating. It's very controlling. And so here was another example. Perspective in art, the realistic novel, which didn't exist in the pre-modern period, no longer is the dominant concern in the postmodern period. And once again, we have this modernism bracketed. And that brought to mind the wonderful introduction to Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Rise of Capitalism, where he discussed a whole bunch of such phenomena full of praise, like orchestras, where you have one conductor standing in front and making everybody toe the line and follow his baton, a little bit like the perspective phenomenon. You have to have that baton is the place where everybody's eyes are fixed, including you, the audience, the spectators or the listeners to a concert, as opposed to, let's say, the more flexible construction of a gamelan orchestra, very differently, or a pre-modern musical experience, or a postmodern musical experience. So that's what led me to think of about Epicureanism. What if geometry, as the ancients understood it, as moderns understood it, as we were taught in school, was itself that bracketed kind of modernism? And what if modern mathematics had really gone quite a bit beyond the calculus of Newton, which, as a mathematician, I knew it had? There was Lobachevskian calculus, there was Riemannian constructions, there were kinds of mathematics that didn't depend on, for example, the parallel hypothesis, which is that parallel lines never meet, There could be parallel lines that did meet. There could be all kinds of other assumptions. You could get rid of many of the premises and axioms of Euclidean geometry and create non-Euclidean geometries. And suppose the ancient mathematics of Epicurus and Lucretius were a non-Euclidean geometry. Well, not exactly. It's not exactly a non-Euclidean geometry, but it looks like maybe a way of conceiving of nature that was not yet dominated by the rigors and the structure of Euclidean geometry. It was an alternative geometry back then, which doesn't precisely anticipate, but in some way corresponds to our liberation from the modernist structured geometry. And then, quite by accident, doing no more than reading Scientific American, I came across an article on a thing called omega numbers. And it turns out that what is an omega number? Omega number is a number. It's a number. It's not infinite, but you cannot assign any number to it. It's finite, but cannot be assigned any number. And Lucretius and Epicurus had identified such a magnitude. They said the number of atoms in the universe is infinite, the size of the universe is infinite, but the number of kinds of atoms is not strictly infinite, but incomprehensibly large. And suppose the minimum that they talked about were nothing other than the inverse of this quantity. In other words, to make an atom, how many minima did you need? 10, 20, 50? If you put that kind of number on it, you're going to run into that problem of geometry. You're going to run into the commensurability problem. But suppose I say every atom is made up out of an incomprehensibly large number. You can't give it any quantity whatsoever. And I knew the Stoics and Epicureans had identified such numbers, and they said they were neither odd nor even. It's a very strange phenomena. So in some ways, they looked as though their structures were intuitively departing in significant ways from the dominant modernist Euclidean geometry. And notice modernism starts at different times. In geometry, it starts in antiquity. With perspective, it starts in the Renaissance. With the novel, it starts in the 18th century. That's okay. But in all of these different time scales, there was this bracketed moment of order structure which created a universe from which we couldn't imagine anything else. Everything else was back in the world of myth and lack of rationality. And all of a sudden, that whole world for us is being deconstructed. And in this way, the ancient pre-modern Lucretius became again relevant to postmodernity. Thank you.
I think there's going to be it's a bit of coincidence that the pre-modernists, I think, are going to be ganging up on the modernists a little bit. There's really nice resonances between David's paper and the work that I did for this volume. I was sorry to be late and to miss the opening remarks that Jacques and Liza gave, but I can imagine that they back up something that I've heard very often, which is Lucretius is really hot these days. He's a hot commodity. And I have mixed feelings about this. It's a little bit like a band that you're into and not that many people know about it, and then they become really big, and you're worried that they're going to sell out. But luckily, Lucretius is dead. I don't believe the stories that Jerome told about his death. So if you know that, he has too much Viagra and a lot of psychotic episodes and then commits suicide. One good rule of thumb is not to trust the church fathers on most things, but especially on the Epicureans. I like to think of Lucretius as something like a Homeric hero who dies young on the battlefield. Stay pretty, die young. That's my Lucretius. And so Lucretius doesn't really have to live out his own reception, so he's not historically aged by it. We are, but because Lucretius in a way is sort of protected from that reception, I always find it nice to go back to him. So it's for this reason that I got very interested in Michel Serres' 1978 book, La Naissance de la Physique, which is a reading of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. And around the time that I was invited to take part in the conference from which this volume emerged, I'd been doing some work on Gilles Deleuze's reception of or reading of Lucretius, which Lucretius' Simulacrum, which ends up as an essay at the back of La Logique du Sens. And I had written on that. But I got more and more interested in Serre, especially after the conference, who in some ways has a more perverse reading, I think, of Lucretius than Deleuze does. And it was especially perverse to go to Serre because for a conference on Lucretius and Modernity, a book called Lucretius and Modernity, because Serre does not believe in modernity. I'm not sure if I believe in modernity either, for that matter, but that's something else. So Serre has a different notion of time that he opposes to linear time and historical time as we generally conceptualize it, which some of you may be aware of. So Serre gives an image in a set of conversations that he has with Bruno Latour, which is published in the early 90s, where he gives an account of nonlinear time as kind of topological time by saying, if you take a handkerchief and you mark 2 points on the handkerchief and then you crumple it up and you put it in your pocket, those 2 points, which have been so distant from one another when the handkerchief was laid flat, when it sort of crumpled, may become proximate to each other. So this is the image that he offers there. He offers other images of these counterintuitive notions of sort of folded time. And in that example, in the conversations, Lucretius is his main context. It's Lucretius that he keeps returning to. So Lucretius is kind of the model of this untimely intervention into the present, which somehow resists the idea of linear time. So Serre begins his study of Lucretius, The Birth of Physics, by saying, quote, everyone concedes that atomic physics is an ancient doctrine, but a contemporary discovery. So Serre is always the contrarian, and he sets out to sort of decimate the assumption that lies behind this claim that contemporary physics has disproven Lucretius, and Lucretius should just be left to literary critics and classicists, Latinists, God forbid, but that the real scientists could leave Lucretius alone. So the provocative claim that he puts forth in The Birth of Physics, the one that he starts with, echoing, I think, David's claim, is Lucretius is right. And in French, he says, Lucretius a raison. So Serre starts by defending this claim as if we were to take it in the idiomatic sense of the French. So Lucretius is right. So in essence, the claim is that he discovered chaos theory avant la lettre. Everyone has missed this point by failing to notice that the physics in the De Rerum Natura does have a mathematical base. So this is Serre's claim. He claims that the problem is that in antiquity, physics and mathematics were sort of separated out. So if you want to find the mathematics of the physics of Lucretius's poem, you have to look elsewhere. And he claims to have discovered the mathematics that proves the sort of grounding of Lucretius' physics in the fragments of Archimedes. And Serre is very confident about this claim and about this discovery. I am not a mathematician, and so I can't vouch for this fact, but there's an interesting insight that arises from claiming that, in fact, the physics of Lucretius is grounded on Archimedean mathematics. So the first claim is that, in fact, our problem had been that we've been thinking about a solid state physics, and in fact, what's really being described is a fluid state physics. And this allows Serre to rehabilitate the famous swerve, which David was just talking about, not as an instance of free will. So he is going against Lucretius here, but he claims actually this is a perfectly explicable phenomenon if you shift to fluid state physics. Why? Because the swerve is the appearance of turbulence within any laminar flow. And so in any kind of fluid state, in laminar flow, at a certain point, turbulence will appear. What is laminar flow? I didn't know what laminar flow was. My partner's an architect, and he explained it to me in terms of a fountain shooting up water, and so you have the flow that allows the arc to take place. Just on Tuesday, I was at a wonderful exhibition that Paul Chan had, and he has these breezies, which are these kind of, I don't know what kind of material they're made out of, maybe kind of, it's not plastic, maybe silk, and there's a fan, and they have a kind of column of air, and then he's actually created a point so that turbulence is introduced at a certain point in the column, and they start jerking around in this quasi-anthropomorphic way. So this drove home this idea of laminar flow for me in a new way. Now I'm always going to see these breezies. So anyways, If there were no swerve, there would always be just this rain of atoms. But once there's the swerve, you have turbulence, and turbulence is creativity. It creates these composite bodies which sort of come together and are present for a while and then fall apart again. So you have order, you have disorder, and then you have order that emerges, and then you fall back into disorder. Now for Serre, he would argue that even not just the swerve is a phenomenon, but the theory of the swerve, the understanding of the swerve, is as it were a sort of pocket of order in disorder that appears at one moment in the past. They come to see the theory of the swerve, and then it sort of falls out again. So this would fall, maybe we call that modern physics, and then it reappears in the 20th century as a sort of another pocket of order. So there's an isomorphism between history and time and physics, and that I think is one of the most interesting things that interesting claims that Serre is making in the book. So, at any rate, the physics in play has as a consequence then that history is nonlinear. And in fact, Serre would say that the very convergence of Lucretius and chaos theory proves, in fact, the theory of history. Like, how could Lucretius and 20th century chaos theory come together in this way and be resonant with one another if it weren't true that time is in fact folded or nonlinear? The very account of time that Dave just described wouldn't make sense unless we had some notion of sort of folded time. But then you run into a problem. And the problem is if Lucretius is right, who cares? Like, what difference does it make that Lucretius is right? If, in fact, his claim is not that 20th century physics read Lucretius and then figured it out. His claim is, in fact, that 20th century physics sort of comes at chaos theory on its own terms. And then, once we understand that physics, we understand the reality to which Lucretius's poem provides the soundtrack, as Latour says in an article on Serre. And so it's as if Lucretius is sort of superfluous. He's great, he's right, and if you do the history of science, it's great that people get credit for being right in the history of science, but Serre is interested in more than that. And so I struggled a lot with this question and this problem. Like, if Lucretius is right, he may have proved that, but then he's also just proved by all of this that Lucretius is perfectly superfluous. Like, there's no point to Lucretius getting it right if it's going to be forgotten again and rediscovered for principles that have nothing to do with Lucretius other than the fact that he described them. So part of the challenge here, I think, is just figuring out what the difference is that Lucretius makes. And I can't really do justice to that difference here. And frankly, I don't think I really do justice to it in the chapter. It sort of took me a while to get to this point. But the key is, and I'll just sketch this to stay within time, is that Serre, over the course of the book, starts to unfold the unidiomatic sense of the French expression Lucretius a raison, which is Lucretius has reason. So more specifically, Lucretius has a reason which is not our reason, which is to say Enlightenment reason. So for Serre, the tragedy of Enlightenment reason is that it's too homogeneous. It legislates, everything has to accord with it, or it falls out of its boundaries and it becomes irrational. And Serre, I think, perceptively sees in this move a double delegitimization of antiquity, and particularly pre-modern science. I mean, this would be, I won't get into this, but if you work on reception theory, working in ancient science and medicine, very different than working on, say, Homer, who's timeless and we don't have problems with his human truths. But ancient science is seen as it just becomes obsolete. And so for Serre, the obsolescence of ancient physics is the same kind of obsolescence that the humanities suffer under the regime of sort of Enlightenment reason. And I think that's an interesting insight about the kind of double fate, as it were, of ancient science or ancient physics and the humanities. So on his analysis, the reason, the raison of Lucretius deserves respect. And the nature of that reason entails the imbrication of physics and history. That's one reason why it deserves respect. Another reason that it deserves respect is that the reason of Lucretius folds an ethics into its physics in a way that we find very strange today. It's really a relation between the is and the ought, or ethics and physics, that we find taboo. But physics is, of course, very intimately linked to ethics in antiquity, especially in the Hellenistic period, especially in the Stoics and the Epicureans. And it may seem that that's not true of Lucretius. So we often think Epicureanism is about, look, it's a cold, hard world out there. It's just atoms. There's no providence. Like, the world of humanity is not there. And so, physics and ethics are completely separate. And that misses the point that, in fact, the only reason you're supposed to do ethics in Epicureanism is in order to reach ataraxia, which is an ethical state. So that there are points in the poem where you get this sense that, look, like, here are 15 explanations of this meteorological phenomenon, and it doesn't really matter which one of them is right, because we just need to know that those are really plausible explanations, and if you can buy just one of them, you won't believe that the gods are causing these crazy things to happen, and you're going to be in a better ethical state. So that kind of continuity between ethics and physics is really crucial, even to Epicureanism, even though they go about it very differently than in Stoicism, where you've got God and you've got the Logos, and it goes all the way down. So for Serre, he really embraces this kind of tight relationship to dwell with and to think with, I think, the Epicurean idea of ataraxia as a site for thinking life, as this ephemeral, local singularity, where finitude is really the condition of happiness. So with Lucretius, we're in a physics and in ethics, he says, quote, of the plurality of worlds and of their temporary existence. So the garden for him is a place that respects finitude and respects limits. And one of the key ways of understanding of this respect of limits isn't just mortality, which is a key aspect, but it's also about the limits of any one given form of reason. So that Enlightenment reason, or sort of modern reason, which assumes a kind of absolute applicability and doesn't recognize a kind of plurality of reasons, is seen as sort of ethically problematic on the grounds of kind of Lucretian ataraxia. So to accept Enlightenment rationality is to be, as it were, imprisoned inside the limits of this illusion that you could always be right. And Serre thinks that there are consequences to this illusion, and he jumps kind of grandly to saying that the consequences of this illusion are a kind of violence, and a violence towards nature that he argues represent a physics under the sign of Mars and not Venus. So if Lucretius's poem is a poem in honor of Venus, for Serre what that means is it advocates an ethics of the local, it advocates a logic of the clinamen, and it advocates a kind of proto-ecological politics. So let me just end by saying the claim then for Serre that Lucretius has two meanings, that Lucrece à raison has two meanings, is really key to understanding what he means when he says that Lucretius is our contemporary. There's a double sense when he says Lucretius is our contemporary. So on the one hand, what he means is it's as if the poem is like a cryogenically frozen body that then you sort of, is kissed and is brought back to life. So Latour uses this notion of kind of sleeping beauty, but Serre himself has this amazing story that I won't go into about a father frozen inside a glacier who's like rediscovered by his son. So from one perspective, that's the poem. It's just this thing in the past that's sort of brought to life and lives with us in our world. But on the other hand, as Serre's reading develops, this more literal meaning of the phrase Lucretius has reason starts to unwork the very universality implied by the claim Lucretius is right, by fleshing out this very specific and sort of strange Lucretian reason. So this would be a reason that's committed to ataraxia in all of its forms, from the clinamen to a kind of ethics of minimal deviation. And so for Serre, it's really the strangeness of this vision and the way in which it takes this ethics of local difference and extends it across a spectrum of domains where we're not used to thinking continuity that makes it so vital and strange. It makes it, we might say, untimely. So the point is not for Serre to confirm scientific results. Lucretius doesn't validate contemporary science, and contemporary science doesn't validate Lucretius. So at the end of the day, Serre is quite scathing about the idea, what he says, historical epistemology, that the point is to sort of validate the results. And, that's his take. For him, Lucretius is all about disrupting this idea of universal applicability and giving a very different notion of reason and ethics. So Lucretius arrives in the present not by a law of the same, not because he's just the same as us, but by this idea of what Serre calls a quasi-invariant in a series. And in the series, that minimal difference between Lucretius and us is precisely what makes Lucretius such this stranger in our midst, who becomes someone really important to sort of engage with, but who was always sort of at some distance from us. So I've always fall back on Nietzsche's notion of the untimely and thinking about antiquity as that which is sort of not of our time and acts counter to our time to sort of bring about, I'm going to quote it bad, but bring about something better. And I think Lucretius, in this sense, has that potential in Sarah's hands to come at our sense of the way the world works with both a kind of resonance and a kind of disruption. So I'll finish there.
Wow. I think it's a wonderful presentation. Jacques, we can go to questions, but I wonder if folks on the dais here would want to respond to one another. I know, Brooke, you and David have engaged in a little bit of exchange. I don't know if, Dave, you want to say anything in response, and then Liza.
This is very nice.
Before we turn it over.
Feel so much in sympathy with it that I don't have any comments to offer right away.
Okay.
I think that we should open this to
Me too.
to our audience, because we've said our bit.
And even more.
And
Here. So, comments or questions?
Stephen, I will moderate in a moderate way.
I'll just start the conversation going here. But I was struck with the description of Lucretius that Brooke Holmes provided, and I wonder. I was struck because I was just teaching it at Bartleby, and I just he fits perfectly everything you said. But of course, we can do that kind of perfect fit. The only issue here is stay pretty, die young. Bartleby maybe stays pretty, he definitely dies young. And in that context, I wonder if there's a way to push that image. We don't need to stay pretty, die young in this model. Anyway, I just wonder.
well, could you just say a little bit more about where you would push back on? Because in the context of the story, the narrator, who's his boss, tries to make Bartleby fit into a local system, right, which is a universalizing system. And Bartleby insists on not fitting, but he ends up dying young. But the figure of that, I was just wondering about this stay pretty. That figure. Yeah. That's the only question I had there. Because otherwise it was just exactly a description of what's going on in that story. Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe there's a sense in which that you want some of the tragedy of Jerome's story back for Lucretius. I mean, I think there's something to be said for, well, there are many ways one could go with this, but I think it pulls out something that I didn't bring up, which is this kind of ethics of the local sounds great, but it also suggests a kind of isolation. So if there's not a kind of, what's the community, if there are all of these kinds of local ethics or the garden, and you could even push that further and say, is this a kind of anti-political, Epicureanism is always attacked for being kind of anti-political, and you retreat into the garden and you have your own little world. And so the Bartleby story, I think, you get this sense of yes, you don't fit, but you're isolated. And so, two ways of going about that. So I would say, if Sarah wanted to push back on that, it would be to say, well, it's only from the perspective of a kind of universalizing system or universalized reason that Lucretius becomes isolated or cut off from the series in which he might be understood to take part, because it's just he's grouped with all the rest of, Balzac and other authors who he mentions in this kind of mass of the irrational, of sort of failed theories of whatever, and then, you might connect them in other ways, but not in any real way. So I think that would be one response, but then the question, comes back, well, what is the connectivity? What is it? And it becomes this idea of seriality, but it also becomes the figure of comparatism. And so comparatism for Sartre is a kind of, not just a method, but an ethos. And he talks about comparatism as, putting unlike things together, or things that appear to be unlike, to create these kinds of sparks, or a community that's not immediately apparent, or is not sort of predetermined in advance. And in that kind of electricity, or in that essence, you have a kind of convergence, or a kind of meeting between these two worlds, where there is no master term. And I found that, really interesting when I was working on another piece, and I'll just say the last thing here. I mean, I came back to Sarah on that point because I was thinking very hard about comparatism in relation to the very idea of the classical. Like, we think of the idea of the classical as like a universalizing thing. And somehow it's just a kind of open domain, and pre-modern science, again, isn't going to fit it because it doesn't persist in the same timeless way as the classical. And so by, say, putting, Lucretius together with, contemporary physics or something like that, you create a very different notion of antiquity that's from a form of comparatism. So that might be one way.
If I could kind of hook onto that as well, I take Stay Pretty to be a way of allowing us to talk about aesthetics, or about the aesthetic dimension of the poem, which is something that I'd like to underscore. It's a poem in which it's in the domain of the aesthetic that one of the great paradoxes of the poem is manifest, since the philosophical and thematic concern is with the contingent, the aleatory, the unfinished, the ungenerated. But the poem itself is one of the most extraordinarily formed and carefully formed poetic objects that we know, to the point that the structure of certain words repeats the argumentation in what is often known as the alphabetical paradigm, with the kind of commanding analogy between the letters and the atoms. So the nature of the paradox, if you want to call it a paradox, is that it is an entirely and absolutely finely wrought object whose semantics concerns the unwrougenness of objects, or the contingent consolidation of objects as such. So as a poetic object, what it tells us is contrary to how it tells us. And this is, to my mind, one of the most decisively modern, if you wanted to think about it that way, aspects of the poem. It's quite extraordinary. It stays pretty in kind of preserving and guarding and repeating that paradox. This is what, or that internal contradiction. This is the specific nature of Lucretian aesthetics, is to produce, exacerbate, and maintain that contradiction between the constructedness and the finalizedness and the formedness of the poem qua poem, and the semantic advancing of a cosmology that is not any of those things at all.
Could I add a comment on that as well? Science fiction is back in fashion in the movies, and the one I'm thinking of is Interstellar, where you have folds in time. Very clearly looks like a tissue in your pocket. Here's a character who has actually traveled a spaceship through these tubes that connect one part of the universe to another, temporally as well as spatially, and violate. But that movie boasts in all of its advertising that it had many scientific advisors and that everything in the movie was possible, including a character who's the father of a girl who moves into the future, comes back and advises her on how to discover the things that have enabled him to do the things he's doing. So time is completely disrupted. Now, Lucretius had interesting things to say about time as well. Time is not simply linear and continuous in Lucretius. It's broken up also into minimal bits. So much so that space has minimal bits, time has little minimal bits, and when an object at the microscopic level moves, it's got to leap an interval of space in an interval of time. As a result of which, we have a testimony that says, according to Epicurus, Lucretius's master, it's inappropriate at this level to say that something moves. You have to say it has moved. It was here and it is there, and you can see why. Because the temporal minimum and the spatial minimum, they have extension, but they have no parts. So you can't be halfway through one, or it would have a part. and yet it's an actual distance. So it skips. It just skips right over it. And that conception of time violates what I would call the modernist notion of continuous space and time, which again has become evident to us in certain ways, not exactly in the way that it's envisaged in Interstellar, but Interstellar brings in interesting ways, Sayre's conception of a temporal fold, and could ask, why today? Why are we receptive to science fiction movies of this sort, which bring in concepts that are so strange and yet popular and attracting audiences of all ages and of all sorts everywhere around the country and around the world? What is it that makes us receptive to something so, in principle, so odd? And I would say we are living in some kind of complex postmodern moment for which is intuitively available to us in a way that it wouldn't have been, let's say, ages ago when I was a kid.
The purpose of the poem is to achieve this voluptas, this pleasure, and so science seems to serve this ethical purpose. And that's very different than when I think of science today, which doesn't seem to have that purpose at all. I'm just curious in terms of, that difference in terms of the reason why Lucretius wrote the poem was to help people achieve this state of pleasure. It wasn't knowledge. Knowledge really was to serve a higher end. Any thoughts on that? Or anyone, not necessarily.
Well, I would just say one thing. Modern science is very ethical in its characterization. I think of evolutionary biology, which has infected, and I think that's the right word, thinking on all kinds of levels, as though evolution could explain or can't explain altruism, can explain ethical values or can't explain our modern ethical values. But the ethical dimension of modern science, and it extends into various areas of physics, is, I think, quite alive even today. But let others respond in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some truth, to the idea, Latour's idea, we've never been modern in the sense that kind of separation of ethics and physics was never in practice possible, and we're sort of living through the unraveling. But, in that sense, we are thrown back into this kind of Lucretian moment. But it's, or I even think about, in a kind of more banal sense, the way that we say to, again, to devalue the humanities or other forms of knowledge. It's like, when I say to my students in my ancient medicine class, like, why are you here? Like, why are you not, learning how to go cure cancer? It's like that's the. But I don't say, like, why are you not out, learning to make Frankenstein to take over the world and suck our brains out of our heads or something? You know what I mean? That would be clearly it's better to sit there and learn ancient medicine, than do that. We have this kind of presumption that the ends of science are necessarily good, and that the only way then to the good would be sort of in the service of those technological aims of sort of improving our lives. And the Lucretian perspective is completely inverse. It's to say, sure, philosophy exists. Philosophy is in a way a kind of techne. And in that, he's in a very long line of, philosophical ethics begins as a techne very much akin to medicine. And because, in a way, as human beings and human nature are sort of imperfect, we make the wrong kinds of inferences about the world, and we think there are gods, and we think, there's infinite suffering in hell. And there's a cognitive mechanism that kind of can go both ways. And we need the techne to sort of get it going the other way. But everything is towards the end of sort of living well. But then a lot of energy is put into defending, what is living well? So, voluptas but ataraxia, in Greek, and a lot of defense of what is Epicurean pleasure, how is it different from Stoic ends? All the energy is towards what is the good life. And from that perspective, yeah, we need more attention to what is the good life. We need, when Plato says, great if doctors, have the techne, but they need to, great that they can save a life, but, do they know whether saving the life is the right thing? There's an extent to which that's true, I think, still today, and that, sort of narrowly bioethical questions, to stay on this, or approaches can't really address the harder question of what it means to live well.
I'm torn between my desire to have a glass of wine and my equally great desire to continue the conversation. Perhaps I'll say something extremely brief, which is to expand a little bit on Brooke's point and on Dave, which is that let's say that the commitment, a scientific commitment, which we would all recognize as our own, as Newtonian, as quite modern, to scientific method, and to, its premises, its axioms, repeatability, falsifiability, and so on. This we think of as dogmatic. That is, this is dogma. This is science. And we can be quite objective about it and say that we will follow those rules and that method to where they will lead us. This is a kind of the heroism of the scientific method. And we feel very good about ourselves when we have something disproved, and even better when something is proven, and so on. But the fundamental moment of belief in that dogmatic or axiomatic principle is ethical. And the structure of science is partly intended to obscure that initial ethical commitment to, and by ethical here I mean itself non-falsifiable and non-repeatable commitment to that moment. And that, it seems to me, is something that the more we can disclose, it's not that we're going to be accused of irrationality. Like, oh, those humanists, they have wild hair and they gesture crazily, like. It's necessary to be able to point to that, and Lucretius is, I think, one of the great ways of helping us point to the dogmatic ethicism or dogmatic ethics that underlie even so commonly accepted as objective things as the scientific method.